Good morning, everybody, and welcome to documenting the early history of Black lives in the Connecticut River Valley. My name is Dennis Picard, and I am the president of the board of directors of the Pioneer Valley History Network, one of the participating organizations in this project. This summer, the Pioneer Valley History Network and UMass Public History Program are collaborating on a project to do a deep dive into the archives and repositories held in our historical institutions to recover, explore, and compile the stories of Black people in the early Pioneer Valley. The project aims to first build capacity among both the Pioneer Valley History Network and the staff of its member historical societies and museums, as well as interested individuals, to better document and understand Black life in the Valley, including how those stories are unearthed from archival resources. Second, to support new research on this important subject. And third, to facilitate as participants, both organizations and individuals, draw connections between their findings, creating a whole that's larger than the sum of its parts. And finally, to support the development of new efforts to incorporate these findings into our practice and its interpretation to new audiences. Now, a little bit, because I think for many of you, the Pioneer Valley History Network may be new. I'd like to say what we are. The Pioneer Valley History Network is a resource for local history organizations in Western Massachusetts and the public they serve. We have a lot of individuals that are members of our organization, both large and small archives, libraries, and societies, old ones, new ones. These organizations care for the objects and stories of this region's past. Some are quite small, most are volunteer-run historical societies, others are large museums and complexes. Some focus on their collections, others provide resources and education, and all are committed to the keeping history alive and relevant for future generations. Now, our particular program here today is presented by the Pioneer Valley History Network, but also UMass Amherst Public History Program, the UMass Amherst W.E.B. Du Bois Library, with support from the Massachusetts Humanities. Absolutely, we appreciate the grant funding, and the UMass Amherst Public Service Education Grant. We'd also like to thank the UMass Press, the New England Historic Genealogical Society, the Amistad Press, and Levelers Press for making their text available to be able to use in this project. There are many individuals that have been working for quite some time and actually putting in a lot of hours just getting this project going. And I certainly would like to recognize them from UMass History Department, Marlon Miller, from Pioneer Valley History Network, Cliff McCarthy, Jessica Johnson, Kate Friedman, Emma Lewis, Charlotte Mardishaw, Zoe Cheek, and others that actually have gone back and forth with us with getting the thought process going to get this organized. And it's still a project that's in process. We're still looking at changing our documents and tweaking them to make them more workable for individuals that are going to be doing the actual legwork in the societies, our graduate students, as well as the volunteers that have been working. We've already noted in our meetings before today some outcomes that we're hoping for, and really recognizing some individuals that are out there in the Valley whose stories have been marginalized, that might have been discovered years ago and have not become part of the regular interpretation of history in our member groups and our member societies and museums. I just, with a couple of minutes that I still have, just mention one story. I'm very interested in stories. And there's one story that I just tripped across. I was doing some research in a local cemetery in Westfield, Massachusetts, and happened to notice the stone of Simon Decker. And this was a stone that was issued by the United States government to veterans. So I took a look down at the stone a little bit closer, and I happened to notice that Mr. Decker was a member of the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. And to many of you, that might not mean anything, but the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry was what was classified at the time as a colored unit. And doing a little more research, I was able to find the document the year before Mr. Decker passed away that he filed for a pension from the United States government because of his service. And he was a private in Company B of the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. And I also find that it was very curious that he was 39 years old when he enlisted. He was a laborer, he was married, a man of color in Westfield. There were not very many families at that time here. He was born in the 1820s. And this may be just kind of a curious story, but it relates to today being Juneteenth. The 5th Massachusetts Cavalry was actually sent to Clarksville, Texas, 2 months before the reading of the proclamation, which brought on what we now call Juneteenth. So there's a story, even more than what I've been able to dig out, of Mr. Decker, Simon Decker, and his involvement with why we're here today and why we picked this particular day. I also would want to acknowledge, before moving on, the individuals from the 3 counties in Massachusetts, Hampden, Hampshire, and Franklin County, that have applied for and have been selected to participate in our program. That's the Amherst Historical Society and Museum, the Belchertown Historical Association, the David Ruggles Center, the Forbes Library, the Historical Society of Greenfield, Historic Northampton, the Longmeadow Historical Society, and the Wood Museum of Springfield. All of those groups have agreed to open their archives and their resources, as well as providing some volunteer assistance and some time from their curators and their members to open up their resources to the graduate students who will be looking into what resources they have available. I have to be a little bit vague on that because we know what resources they may have, but we don't know what resources may end up becoming valuable to this particular project. So it's all going to be a discovery for us, and I think we're all just so excited, and certainly by the number of people that have signed up to join us here today. And I thank all of you for taking time off on a beautiful Juneteenth morning, a beautiful Saturday morning weather-wise here in New England to join us and hear what's happening, hear from our panels of experts, and think about, if you will, volunteering in this effort. And we'll be bringing you some more information about volunteering a little later on. With that said, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. And I'd like to start bringing up our first panel. We have Dr. Ian Delahanty, Dr. Gretchen Gerzina, and Dr. Usman Power Green. Thank you 3 for joining me here today. I know Dr. Power Green's having some technical difficulties. He's going to be joining us as soon as he can, but with the credentials that both of you that I have on screen with me today have, I'd like to really give you an opportunity to introduce yourselves, telling us maybe what in your experience would be relevant to why we're here today, and what interested you in joining us and joining in this project. And also, thank you so much for providing the videos and the interviews that we did. Just some amazing information there. And I hope those of you that had an opportunity to see that beforehand will agree with me. And they're still available. There are still links available at our site to be able to join in and catch those. But anyway, if I could just turn it over to both of you, if you'd like to, whoever wants to go first. Dr. Grazini, I guess if you want to go.
I thought maybe we'd do it in alphabetical order.
Well,
complicated. I will just quickly say that I came to this particular area of research through the back door. Most of my research is actually British. I've published 9 books, and 4 of them are on Black Britain. And I did another one last year, and it wasn't until I was living in Guilford, Vermont, and my mother, who is known to some of the people on these panels, pointed out that in my town, a Black family had lived. And so that sort of sent me down the rabbit hole, and I ended up not only researching in a deep archival way and bringing my husband into the research, even though he's not an academic or a researcher. And we started finding things that had not been known. It was actually what I thought was going to be a year was 7 years, because things are just not there in the way you expect to find them in the kind of archival research that we all do. So I'm looking forward to talking to people about how we go about some of this.
I noticed in one of the interviews that you provided that your husband got, I was going to say he got roped in. He graciously went into medical records. Is that what I was understanding? He read some medical documents?
He did everything. He did everything.
Oh, okay.
He started at the beginning from me, and there's nothing like a fresh eye. We academics are used to writing books and finding things, and then someone who's not of our tribe comes along and says, oh, well, maybe things aren't done this way. Maybe they didn't have paper or so that they would have put things in a different part of the town records than you thought. And he would just sit for a moment and flip a book open, and there would be 7 years of town meeting records about this family we were researching. He made all the best finds. I have to say I was enormously envious, but he did also look up the medical records and translate them from abbreviated Greek and Latin.
And Dr. Delahunt.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, just thank the Pioneer Valley Historical Network and UMass and the other folks that are contributing to this project. I think, as Gretchen puts it, come at it through the back door. My training is in Civil War era American history. My research publications at this point have been in that field. And so part of that is involved looking at the 3 African-American regiments from Massachusetts that Dennis mentioned at the start there, one of them at least. And as I kind of am transitioning from my first project to a second one and kind of looking for where that might be in the archive, I'm thinking of how, I work at a predominantly teaching institution, right? And getting my students to understand the sort of bigger picture through local histories and stories has really been, what I've focused on a lot. And I think that's how I've kind of really started to take a deep dive into the history of slavery in early New England in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially. I haven't yet had much of a chance to get into the archive in the field, and I'm sort of still feeling my way through the scholarship of it. But I think that's how I kind of am approaching it right now, is looking to use these kind of, lesser known biographical or sort of smaller community stories in order to sort of open things up, open people's eyes up to broader connections, throughout New England, throughout the Atlantic Ocean world. So that's how I'm kind of coming at the topic that we're on today.
And are you both, just because you brought up about classes, are you both teaching any classes that are right now that would be relevant to this particular subject?
Yeah, so I regularly teach at Springfield College our African American history class, but also our public history class, really trying to get students to see history as more than just textbooks and lectures, and getting them out into historical museums, historical sites in the region. And that's also another avenue that this particular project is really of interest to me, is because I've taken my students a lot to the various places throughout the valley where some of these histories took place and where they're, to some extent visible, but thinking about how to use those places to kind of tell that broader story is something that's really of interest to me.
And I'd like to just break in for a second to welcome Dr. Usman Power Green. Good to see you. Glad you could work out your technical difficulties and appreciate you seeing here. We've just really got started. And I was just asking folks to introduce themselves because you all have such tremendous credentials, but anything that would be relevant to our particular topic here today. And, if you're doing anything as far as what I just asked about, is any classes that are relevant to early Black lives in this area?
Yeah, so first, let me just say that I was actually listening on my phone. So I was with everybody. Thank everyone for being here. And I apologize, my camera, my computer wasn't working. But I have my mother's computer. She's always great. In a pinch, so I'm fortunate. So there's two ways to answer the question. The first is straightforward. Right after I finished my dissertation, I did research on the colonization movement more broadly, and the project was going to be about the colonization movement in New England. And so I took many of the documents that I gathered into the smaller historical societies, looking at very, very, whatever I could basically find of the many small colonization organizations and associations in New England, right? So that took me, sort of wherever I could go. Since then, and it's been a couple years, maybe a decade plus, my project has changed, and so now I'm writing about, and I'm hopefully going to finish this manuscript within the next year, but about Blacks who left to go to Liberia, and so looking at them in New England, looking at them in the sort of primarily in the North, primarily in the Northeast. Massachusetts becomes a very interesting site for all of this because those that choose to go are sort of in this paradox, right? Because on one hand, many Blacks in my first book, as those who were able to see the C-SPAN episode, but I talk about Blacks who are against colonization. And so this project has really focused on those that chose to go, who I'm calling Black colonizationists. And there were those, Eric Weber, I don't know if he's here, many years ago pointed out a couple families, and other local historians have pointed me towards individuals who have gone. And so it's been great to do that work and to partner with local historians who are doing great local work, because obviously as a scholar, there's such a small group that it's very difficult to sort of trounce around all the societies to attempt to find them. So I really rely on all of you all to help me with that research. So,
well, since you mentioned it, I'm going to jump in with a question that's just one of mine. But having seen the material that you provided for us to view beforehand, not to get all judgmental, but kind of, do you think those individuals that decided to go with the colonization movement and people of color, do you think they drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak? Do you think they bought in to the philosophy that had been created by the whites? And
so this is one of the great paradoxes and thesis of my book, which is that actually, I argue that Black Americans actually are central to the colonization movement from the start. So I'm sort of taking on the argument that is the central argument, which is that it's a white-led organization and always has been. And actually, what I'm trying to argue is that not only Black perspectives, but also those that joined early on, starting with Daniel Coker in Baltimore, were central to shaping the ideology and the mission from day one. And so, I'm challenging those that argue that, the more famous people that left, John Russwurm, who will become governor of the colony in Maryland, that they quote unquote drank the Kool-Aid. Actually, I'm arguing that these are some of the brightest, most passionate defenders of Black liberty in the country. Why are they choosing to go? Why are they joining the movement? Not just going passively, but actively joining the movement. Even Martin Delany in 1860, 1859. So, it's a fascinating story. and those that went from being anti-colonization to supporting the movement and seeing it as an important, viable option. I'm trying to challenge the argument that they all sort of, were somehow duped.
And I just to spread this out here, I'm gonna read you some questions. I know some were submitted beforehand, but let's open this up for everybody to start with. A runaway advertisement posted by a slave owner in my town includes the word "a mulatto or Indian sold to me by authority." Does anyone have a thought as to what that might have meant?
So I'm curious to know the fuller context, the broader context surrounding that, the phrase there. I mean, as I read that question and thought about the meaning, mulatto meaning a person of mixed race, but the phrase that's probably a bit more in question is Indian sold to me by authority. The 1641 Body of Liberties in Massachusetts, which is the colony's first set of codified laws, provided for basically three means by which one could become legally enslaved in the colony. To be taken captive in a so-called just war, to sell themselves willingly or to be sold by someone else, or third, to be basically judged as a slave in the legal system. And my sense is that that's probably what that meant. That taking a guess that means this person has been adjudged, and typically this might happen because a Native American person was indebted, had committed some sort of like petty crime, and a judicial, a magistrate would proffer a sentence of enslavement. I don't know that for certainty, but that's my kind of inclination as to what that might mean.
Yeah, a lot of times we see these documents like newspaper ads, and of course, we just have the 15 words that are in that ad. We can't go back and question what the author meant, but the person who wrote it assumed that the readers would understand what he or she meant by that wording. So it can be tough. So Dr. Gerzina, when you were growing up in Springfield, how aware were you of the history of slavery and abolition in the area? And did you feel like you learned more about these histories from formal education or by reading the world and landscape around you?
Well, that presumes a lot of things.
Yep.
It presumes that anybody taught about slavery. It presumes that people knew that slavery existed in the North. None of those things happened to me. I've never taken a course. I'm a literature professor, not a historian, although I write history. But I never took a course on American history growing up in public schools, which were excellent, by the way, in those days. Springfield schools were really great. But I never saw the word slavery mentioned. I don't remember ever anybody talking about it. And I certainly don't think anybody was in a position to know anything about it or to be able to teach about it. And even when my book, Mr. and Mrs. Prince, was published, people were amazed to find out that slavery existed in the North. So, and these were often teachers. So that I think that packs in a lot of assumptions about what people knew and were capable of teaching and learning. So I knew nothing until, I knew it existed in the North, and that was as a much older adult with a graduate degree, but I never read about it or talked about it or read about it. And in fact, I was thinking this morning, I think when I was growing up, I only saw 3 books that had and this is fiction, that had any Black people in them at all. And I don't think one would of course would have been Huckleberry Finn, but one, and that was of course taught with great embarrassment, through middle school, junior high school. I read a book once about a kind of romantic book when I was in elementary school about a young Black woman who fell in love with somebody, and the first thing she wanted to do was get her hair straightened. That was the only book I remember. And I remember my mother being appalled when I not only brought home little Black Sambo, but liked it so much I brought home all the sequels, not thinking twice about it. My mother just swallowed and let me read them, and then didn't say anything like, did you think that was a good book? What do you think? So I think, I think we still have a long way to go. I'm not sure how much anybody still knows about this subject that you are also wonderfully working on. And even in the places where I did research, it wasn't available. I remember going to a historical society in Hartford, was it West Hartford? And didn't want to tell them that the person I was looking for was African American, because they can't put two and two together. So they just said, oh, I'm sorry, we don't really have many records on African Americans. But what I was searching for was the white family that had owned this person and taken him from Connecticut to Massachusetts. And I was looking for those family records to see what might be mentioned in any of their records. And it never occurred to her that white people's and Black people's histories were entwined and interrelated, and that you could find things that way. So I think we shouldn't fault teachers or school systems. I think it's done much more, but I think people don't realize how far back it goes. Bijah Prince was born in 1706. He's roughly a contemporary of Benjamin Franklin. So this is long ago.
So, I know Springfield has for quite some time promoted the connection with John Brown, even though they let his house be torn down. But you never even remember getting any of that point of view.
Well, that's a different question. Because
Okay.
the question was about schools. I grew up and was baptized in St. John's Congregational Church.
Sure.
And they had...
Oh, can you just explain that for people that, have people from all over about the St. John's connection?
Yeah, St. John's is a church that had been started by African Americans, I think as early as 1844. And it was called the Freeman's Church, and then something else. And it became one of the few Black Congregationalist churches. And my family joined that church. We were a mixed race family. My father was Black, my mother was white, and there were no white churches that we could join. And her father had been a minister in the Berkshires. So, and she later went on to get a degree from the Hartford Seminary in education. So, but St. John's was where I grew up, and it was a Black church, and it was very well regarded. And they had John Brown's Bible. Years later, my sister asked them, this is decades later, where the Bible went. And they said, oh, they didn't know. And she tried to explain to them what a treasure they had and how he had actually been a member. John Brown, the famous abolitionist, had been a member of St. John's. He actually joined it. He had a house in Springfield. He was a firebrand. And St. John's was very proud of that relationship they'd had with him. I think they have since, I've been back, they've since found the Bible and put it in a place of honor, and they realize what a treasure it is. But so Springfield churches are a different story from the school system. And we learned a lot of the Black history we knew from belonging to the church.
So, Dr. Power Green, I know we have the folks from the Ruggles Society, Ruggles Museum here that's involved with this particular grant. And you did a presentation on the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, and you mentioned about the fugitive slave law. I know, we read in Thoreau about his relationship with fugitive slave law, and certainly in Boston there's a lot. But do you have anything that you can add in on the impact of Western Massachusetts and the fugitive slave law?
Yeah, there's a few ways into it. I mean, the first being the resistance in Northampton to the fugitive slave law. The few Black Americans who lived in Northampton, and some of whom affiliated with those who were a part of the association, were outspoken against the law, and really helped shape once again what those who are neutral and didn't get it, right? What exactly it meant. Right. And so, people who were associated with this sort of, this communitarian society were we're literally attempting to help people understand the broader meanings of slavery across the country, right? And that's white racial attitudes. And so central to what Ruggles, Samuel Hill, others, Truth, when she was there, part of the challenge was helping people understand the ways in which the Cotton Kingdom extended into the North, the ways in which what you bought contributed to enslavement and racial slavery. And then with the passage of fugitive slave law, what it means for your black neighbors to be, on guard and hunted, right, by those that can make a pretty penny from accusing you of being a runaway slave, right? And of course, they're going to sprint right to Northampton because they, slaveholders brought their enslaved people to Northampton, right? We're going to do an episode with Self-Evident Media about the Blended case and others. And so part of what, we have to deal with when we're thinking as teachers, particularly, I know some teachers are on here, is to break the, South slavery, North freedom structure, right? It's a structured way of thinking about Massachusetts, and so as Professor Holbrook said, it's hard to have a conversation about slavery in Massachusetts when the only time you talk about black people or, anything is, oh yeah, we're the place where there's freedom, right? This is free Massachusetts, right? And so we not only disown slavery, as the classic, work on it talks about, but we're like cognitive dissonance about the reality of racialized life in the Pioneer Valley, right? Racialized life in Springfield. Why someone like, why John Brown will join that church, right? He's doing that on purpose. He's poking the eyes of those that, in Wilbraham and other sort of towns join the colonization movement. Some out of sympathy, which I'm going to talk about, right, in terms of Massachusetts and those who do end up joining. But others, who see blackness as a problem. Right. So that's another way into it, as teachers, is thinking about, not just celebrating the abolitionist tradition, but recognizing the anti-black tradition as a feature of life in Massachusetts and the Pioneer Valley in these places.
Well, I'm going to throw out to all three of you. It seems like an appropriate time, since we are talking about education, about teachers. When do you think we should start introducing some of these ideas into the education of in the public schools? Is this something elementary school, right? I know there's so much detail we could get into, but is it something immediately in elementary school that we should just jump in and start introducing at least the themes, and then maybe get into more of the details in some of the upper grades? If you follow that, how do we introduce the ideas?
I would say that, as soon as you start, and I should look back through the standards, I should know this offhand, but, as soon as you start talking about the origins of colonization, the origins of the colony itself, you should start talking about the origins of enslavement, because they go hand in hand. They're simultaneous processes. You can't talk about the origins of the Massachusetts Bay Colony without talking about, dispossession of native lands, the enslavement that often accompanied that of Native American peoples, and then the simultaneous process of the procurement of enslaved Africans, which begins at least in 1638 and is, prevalent, through much of the colony and throughout the region of New England, and certainly up into the Connecticut River Valley, by the mid 17th century. So whenever that comes up in the curriculum, that's when it should be introduced. That would be my point of perspective, at least.
I mean, I could just jump in and say, I do a lot of work with teachers, and, part of our response collectively, I started teaching high school. It was my first, job, and I worked at Williston, and then I worked at Amherst High School. And, a lot of what we do is we just don't talk about it as a way to deal with our uncomfortable. So when I think about the kindergarten teachers who I've met and talked with, who actually teach and talk about slavery with kindergarten students, their approach is one that doesn't emphasize per se, the things that we think, they can't really fully comprehend. For example, the levels of violence, right? I mean, that's what everyone, of course, immediately goes to, because as adults, that's been central to what those of us who learn late about enslavement and sort of get slapped with how violent it was as a way to wake us up and learn more. The problem with that sort of approach is that it sort of places everything into a sort of intellectual structure that is basically very negative, right? So you get kids in fourth grade who don't, who are like, I don't want to talk about enslavement because not because I don't want to learn about sort of Africans' contributions to the country. It's because I just don't want to, as the one black kid in the class, I just don't want to hear about how, black people were being beaten and beat down, right? Where suddenly it becomes a story of, of oppression, as opposed to understanding the various and complex dynamics that are at play. And that's what we need to do, right? We need to they get it. They can understand a lot, a lot more than we think. And what they don't understand as elementary school students, we wait till middle school to get into some of the more complex aspects of it. At the Ruggles Center, we bring people over and talk about the free black experience. I believe we could talk about the experience of enslavement, which we do. But those who teach earlier history in different grades would be well served talking about the important contributions of indigenous people, African Americans, and others, as opposed to sort of like skirting it because we're uncertain and uncomfortable with the part that makes us uncomfortable as adults, right? That is, emphasized sort of violence and dispossession, which becomes, again, the key to mobilizing people for things like reparations. So,
yeah, I agree with that. And I've never taught children, and I've never taught in a public school. But I would say that the first thing is to let people know that this history, as Ian said, was hand in hand with American history, that Black people were here, Native Americans were here, that the things to even start the conversation is to this recognition of a presence. When everybody, I grew up with Johnny Tremaine and these stories about Massachusetts liberation, and so I was, even myself, when I was doing my research, was surprised to find out how many people in the Pioneer Valley and in western part of the state, because a lot of the stuff is talked about with Boston, to just say, yes, there was a real active presence. People are amazed to find out that in 1752, 17 of the houses on the main street in Deerfield had enslaved people living in them. They had guns, they hunted, they defended the town, they ran away, they did all sorts of things. There were bad stories, but even acknowledging that they existed and that you can see the houses that they lived in today. And that's 100 years before we're talking about the Underground Railroad in other towns. I think just starting children to understand that this is not just some modern invention, that this is something that's been going on for a long time. And I totally agree with Professor Power Green that this is not something that should start from the perspective only of oppression, but I think start from the perspective of presence might be the best way to go.
And I'll just throw in a little personal note here. At one time, I'm not doing it anymore, but I was on that super secret committee that reviewed books that were approved to be used for teaching history in Massachusetts and reviewing the standards. And part of the problem that I would always be frustrated about is the books were submitted to us. If the books are not out there that have the resources in them, how does the teacher get around that? And when you talk about being uncomfortable, what about being white and being uncomfortable about teaching some of these aspects of slavery?
Well, actually, I think that some of the best work done by many of the people who are here, you included, has been actually the experience of going to spaces. And so while we're professional writers and readers, when it comes to young people, I found the work with the youth at the Ruggles Center, we bring them out, is best through interaction, right? It's looking at documents that are singular, as and sort of providing the storytelling as professional storytellers we are, we tell you give them the document, you ask questions, then you tell them the story, you take them to a house, a location, it gets them involved and interested, as opposed to being sort of reliant on a much more sort of narrow pedagogy. And then the second thing I would say is, the digital world, people at the Ruggles Center, have worked tirelessly to make things available digitally with narrative images that teachers can use, parents can use, anyone can use if they want to understand it. Understand the Black experience, it's particularly abolition, particularly, and then these sort of things. And so, while the challenge is always sort of catching up and judging, well, should we teach this book, that book? We are in an age, and I don't know if my colleagues here have found this with the students. you sign a book and, how many anyway read the book, right? It's like the love of physicality of works we might have to talk about also. But that doesn't mean that they're still not engaging. And it doesn't mean that they're, not finding things. It just means we have to accept, the digital world we live in, but always the stories around either, that our parents told and images and walk around. To me, as a kid who ran around all the time, I was always more interested in that anyway. So that's the possibility, as opposed to the frustration with the reality, which is the structures in place, which you mentioned, Dennis, like the structures bring the books to us, which is frustrating. We want to pick them and bring them, right? That's a structure. That makes it more challenging. But we also have this great infrastructure, particularly in this educated community, the Pioneer Valley, all the universities, to tap us and others to come out, and now with Zoom, to bring these stories to young people and send them on quests. Professor Delahanty in Springfield, send them on a quest to go find some statue or monument, and come back and give me a call and come on Zoom for 10 minutes. What'd you guys find? There's so many ways to do it that are already being done, that make it much more engaging.
Yeah, just to add on to that, one of the best activities I've ever done is had my students look up the history of Primus Mason in Springfield. Mason Square is a stone's throw from our campus. And they're amazed by the life he led, by the power he had in the local Black community in Springfield, and it's enlightening, right? It's, as I said earlier, using these kind of biographies, sort of local histories to get at the bigger picture, I think really can be quite effective. And this is college, right? But I think it works, down the grade levels as well.
And we use on our landing page for the illustration, we use a picture of the front of Thomas's restaurant, and he's just, we don't have time to get into all that, but he's just such an amazing individual and an amazing man. And why don't more people know about him? He's one of the characters I make sure I mention to everybody with dealing with local history. But to move on here, Dr. Delahanty, your talk traces early connections between Indigenous and Black history and enslavement in the Connecticut Valley. Can you speak a bit to the relationship between Native and Black communities and the periods beyond when your talk ends?
Yeah, and I kind of looked at this question and thought of two different ways to respond to it in terms of what the connection or relationship, what that might mean. One's a really negative sort of framing, which is that, as I mentioned earlier, the removal, the forced dispossession of Native peoples in Massachusetts went sort of as a mirror process, as one historian has described it, with the introduction of African slavery into the colony. And so as English colonists are moving further and more aggressively to seize Native lands, to make the lands productive, to make them profitable, they're relying more and more over the 17th and especially into the 18th century. And in certain regions, of course, but they're relying more heavily on enslaved labor. I think another, and I would say equally, if not more important way to answer the question would be to think about the community development between the two groups. Interracial marriage between whites and people of color was banned in each New England colony, but interracial marriage between different communities of color wasn't. And by the mid to late 18th century, due to sort of demographic dynamics within each community, Indigenous communities having a strong preponderance of women, as many men had gone to sea as whalers, as fishermen. Others were forced to fight as in colonial militias. And so we have a large number of single Native women, and also a kind of correspondingly high number of single African or African-American men. And so by the mid to late 1700s, you have significant rates of intermarriage between the two communities. So you think of someone like Paul Cuffey, the famous whaler from Dartmouth, Massachusetts, right? The son of an African man and an Aquina-Wampanoag woman is being just one example of this. But yeah, I think you can look at it from both of those kind of dynamics.
And that continues, I know, from research I've done right into the 19th century between southern New England, Connecticut Valley, but also out into Worcester County and in northern Connecticut. The Native communities in northern Connecticut seem to be the area where a lot of these, and it tends to be, for whatever reason, a lot of the brides tend to have come through and then moved up into this area. Dr. Grazina, another aspect, and we only have about 10 minutes but for this part of our program, but one aspect that we're looking at is the actual research and trying to help people look at the documents, maybe the usual suspects, if you will. But for you, what was the most surprising place to find a document or some information for your particular story?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing because, I went into this project thinking that I would write the book in a year and that everything would be in my local history society, which turned out to have a file folder of newspaper clippings, and that was it. And it ended up taking 7 years because you're following breadcrumbs everywhere. People are so used to getting on a computer and finding information that they don't realize where that information comes from and how hard fought the battle is to find some of that information. But I thought about this question. I would give you three really quick discoveries. The first one was my white family, my mother's ancestral family, arrived from England in 1635. They were here for quite a long time. When I was trying to discover things, my mother was a genealogist, and I told her I was going back in this slave owner's family who had owned Abijah Prince, and that I had come across some names that were very familiar. And she said, well, don't get your hopes up. And then I went to her house, we pulled out all her binders, all her original research, and lo and behold, I was descended from my ancestral family, owned Abijah Prince, the man I was writing the book about, the enslaved man. Everybody insisted on thinking whenever I would give talks that of course I was descended from the Black enslaved people. And I said, no. So that was the first thing. And once I made that discovery, I felt like they gave me permission to write this book, to find these people. The second one was my husband was in the Springfield, what was it? The records office, but it was records of property records. It was land records. It wasn't people records. And he found Abijah Prince's manumission in there with things with houses being sold. It didn't belong there. We don't know where it came from. And it upended the whole story because it told the story in a very different way. We found out he actually had freed himself. And then the third discovery was in an annex to a library at University of Vermont, where they had boxes and boxes of uncatalogued things. And as we were going through, we were trying to find out if Lucy Terry had ever actually argued a court case. And in this box was a notebook of the lawyer on the opposite side of the big case in Vermont. And it outlined when the case met every time and who brought the case. And it turned out to have been brought by her sons. So these were three remarkable things that you could not find in a catalog. You could not find anywhere else, that I could not have done on my own, but it was serendipity. So I think a lot of this is just you run across something and it changes everything.
Yeah, that's great. I noticed in your presentation, again, it's available online, folks, if they haven't seen it yet, you talk a little bit about that story. Dr. Power Green, looking at the big picture down, upward triangle, where would you advise somebody start? Now, you do research as a profession. We've got a lot of very well-intentioned volunteers or amateurs. I hate using amateurs because of their enthusiasm and so forth, but how do you get started doing your research?
Well, I think that Professor Holbrook actually has it right. I mean, I think that starting with our own families is always, to me, a way into it, particularly in the Pioneer Valley. I know, I've talked to parents who tell me stories. One particular family that had done some research on their presence in Northampton, and it turned out that when their family came over, they had bought a home from a Black family that left after the Fugitive Slave Law. Right. And so that was very interesting to them because it sort of tied, their own sort of family to this greater conversation, that was happening in the nation. It's happening sort of like now around, thinking about the consequences of racism in the New England. What's the consequences of it? And the consequences are people, sold low to get out, and that value and that demographic shift was real. And so, you know, for all of us who are on here, I think you start there. There's just so many questions to be answered that individuals, you know, if we do follow individuals, you know, it's some of what I'm trying to do to look at sort of ordinary people, right? You sort of, you look at individuals, you attempt to find them, but it's the collective global world now that's digital. But it's all people living in every house that finds a box, you know, or every story they're able to uncover about their family that tells me helps fit in a piece to this, you know, much, you know, my case, for my research, a very, very complex and long and sort of and big story. And so my goal is to offer that, you know, as a historian, sort of a person who's able to be paid to spend time doing research and writing, right? That's what we do. And that's all, by the way, that's the only difference. I mean, I get paid to research and write. Y'all, you know, everyone here, teachers, you know, locals, y'all are doing it and not being paid to do it. Some of y'all should be being paid and being paid a lot more if you are being paid, right? That's really what separates us. Is the fact that you know, my university is keeping me on because I'm claiming that's what I'm doing, right? So I just want to clarify that. But and so in my case, partnering with an individual who wants to do research about their individual family, a hamlet in some town that finds anything that says about anything about Black people, right? Everything is helpful, because part of the challenge, particularly looking at Black women, you know, I went to a symposium on researching Black women in the 19th century a few years back in Philly, you know, as a group of scholars at a conference. And, you know, the reality is that it's very difficult using our methodology to find and hear the voice in the same way. And that's, of course, ordinary people as well, right? So, and so we sort of have to function collectively when we're doing Black history. We have no choice. You know what I mean? There's just not enough stuff out there. And then when stuff is found, you know, we need to share it. We need to analyze it. We need to be in conversation. And so, you know, I invite, as my colleagues, I'm sure would, everyone who's interested, right, to do research, to go out, you know, from the local library. We have fantastic local libraries, outstanding scholars and intellectuals who work there. We have, you know, outstanding public historians who are doing work in communities. And so there's so many places and so many ways to do the work, to do research, and add to the conversation. And I mentioned Eric Weber because, you know, his work in Williamsburg, I mean, just, he's been so helpful and so influential, because it's like when you just get one story of a person, it allows you some, like, you're like, all right, how can I find more? Where, you know, I mean, I should call more places, right? And it encourages you, because often the silences are much longer than the loud voices, you know, in terms of doing research. So yeah, those are some of my responses and my, you know, again, encouragement to everybody to remember there are lots of different roles in this, and we're all trying to look at Black history, and, you know, or at least those who are interested in it have an opportunity to join in the conversation.
And we're up against the time, so it's probably not fair to you, Dr. Delahunty, but I just wanted to ask, I know people were very interested about the use of visual resources like embroidering and painting, and you use that in one of your presentations. What should we be open to, or what should we be looking for and careful about in those resources?
This one I can answer quickly, because to be totally honest, I'm an historian trained to work in documents. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the Civil War era historian. I work in regimental muster books and, you know, letters and diaries. And so I rely heavily on those who are trained in working with material and visual culture. I think we're going to hear from Dr. Bella Baptiste later on, whose own work in archaeology is a great model for this, and I'd encourage folks to make sure to stay on to listen to her. Dr. Holbrook's book on the princes, you know, makes wonderful use of the material goods that they purchased, and what that tells us about their identities and about their place in the community. And so these two scholars, there are many others that are really deeply trained in the study of visual and material culture. And I'm not one of those folks and wouldn't want to pretend to be.
Well, thank you very much. And thank all of you for agreeing to come and talk to us today. We have a much larger audience than we had expected, and we're so thrilled with that. And I would like to spend an entire day just with this, and I know the audience would too, just with you three. But as you say, we've got some fantastic other speakers and other contributors that are coming up. And we're up to our break time. So I appreciate it. And thank you on behalf of the Pioneer Valley History Network. Thank you.
Yeah, thank everybody.
Yeah, thank you.